Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today to talk about the Global Tax Evasion Report 2024. And so, let me jump right in. What's happening to global tax evasion? These issues of international tax evasion have been very high on the policy agenda over the last 10, 15 years. And there has been a number of important agreements that have been signed by countries to better address those issues. And, unsurprisingly, the people who've been crafting these agreements, are very proud of them. And I remember, for instance, a former French president who said it's the end of tax havens. And so what we wanted to do in that report is to say, okay, look, what can we say based on the available evidence, the available data, about the effectiveness of the different efforts of the last decade, okay? And so this is work that's been conducted by the EU Tax Observatory, which is an independent research lab that I created at the Paris School of Economics in 2021 with a staff of about 20 researchers. But this report is also drawing on the work of a much broader community of researchers who are working on these issues globally. And I feel very lucky to be part of that community. I remember when I started my PhD in 2008, 2009, these issues of offshore wealth, tax evasion by multinational companies and so on, they didn't attract a ton of attention from economists. They were studied by people in the broader social sciences, although there was a lot of very good work in NGOs, and there was good work by journalists, but very little economic work. And today it's really, on the contrary, it's really a thriving community with more than 100 researchers working on these issues globally. Let me just say also that most of the data that we show in the report is available online in this new website, the Atlas of the Offshore World, where you can find series on things like how much offshore wealth is owned by residents of the different countries in the different tax havens, or how much profits are being shifted by multinational companies to places like the Cayman Islands, and so on. So it's really the go-to place if you want up-to-date statistics on these issues. And before diving into the results, just perhaps one last thing. Why do we need a global tax evasion report? Why is it important, in particular, to take a truly global perspective on these issues? It's for the following reason. Too often, tax policy is analyzed in a purely domestic context. And that can be pretty misleading. Because in a domestic context, we can say, okay, look, if we cut the corporate tax, for instance, we are going to be able to attract some activity. Some multinational companies are going to move production, or maybe they're going to shift some profits. And so that's going to be good from a domestic, national perspective. But if you take a global perspective, you immediately understand that tax competition, just like offering financial opacity services, bank secrecy or things like that, from a global perspective, it's a zero-sum process. Or in fact, it's worse than that. It's negative sum, because the main beneficiaries of international tax competition, of financial secrecy, or the shareholders of multinational companies, or the wealthy individuals who can avoid and sometimes evade taxes. And so it fuels inequality. So you can see how policies that, from a very narrow national perspective, can be construed as, good. Okay, look, we're attracting employment, fees, tax revenues, activity. It's fantastic. In fact, from a global perspective, are really negative sum. And the only way, what this means is that the only way to really properly analyze all these things is, in my view, the only valuable way, or the most valuable way, is to take this global perspective. So fundamentally, we need perhaps an equivalent for taxation of the IPCC that you all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We need some organization or some community of people who take a truly global perspective on tax systems, on their impact on inequality, and on their sustainability. So, that's the perspective that we try to adopt in that work. Okay, so now the results. Results, the short summary is like in the movie that you all know and that was already cited once: the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I'm going to start with the good. The good points to the fact that we've made progress collectively in addressing one specific form of tax evasion. which is the concealment of wealth in offshore tax havens. So that's what the graph here shows. So what does this graph show? So on the x-axis you have time. On the y-axis you have offshore wealth at the global level, meaning financial assets like equities, bonds, mutual fund shares, owned by households in banks outside of their home country. Global offshore wealth as a fraction of world GDP. Okay, and so you can start with the blue line, which is just this total amount of offshore wealth globally. It's quite stable. Around 10% of world GDP is held by households offshore, primarily in countries with a tradition of strict bank secrecy rules. What the orange line shows is that historically, until 2016-2017, the bulk of that wealth evaded taxation, was not reported to tax authorities. Or to be more precise, the income generated by that wealth, because most countries don't have a wealth tax, but most countries have an income tax, the dividends and capital gains and interest income generated by that wealth was not duly reported to the respective tax authorities. Okay, about 80-90% of that wealth evaded taxation. And then something happened, starting around 2016-2017, and this orange line, this untaxed offshore wealth, started to decline quite dramatically. And what is this thing is that since 2017, there is an automatic exchange of bank information between countries. More than 100 countries participate in this new form of international cooperation, which marks a major departure from the era of bank secrecy that prevailed before. So before 2017, it was really easy for wealthy people to hide assets, to be very concrete, in places like Switzerland or like the Cayman Islands. The banks in those countries would not inform the tax authorities of their customers. Since 2017, banks, and 2018 in the case of Switzerland, banks in these countries have to automatically share data each year about the income earned by their clients, about the assets owned by their clients. Okay, and so it's very important for the following reason. The point is not to say that, look, we've solved tax evasion, we are living in the best of all possible worlds. As I'm going to argue, we have really major critical issues that remain. But the point is, this is important because it shows something which is crucial, which is that tax evasion is not some kind of law of nature. Tax evasion, it's a policy choice. We can choose to tolerate it, and we've tolerated that particular form of tax evasion, offshore tax evasion, for a very long time, for decades. Just like we can make other choices, and we can choose to create new forms of financial transparency and new forms of cooperation. And what this shows is that new forms of international cooperation that were deemed utopian 10 or 15 years ago. I remember when I started working on these issues, the notion that there could be an automatic exchange of bank data, that Swiss banks would send information to the UK tax authority, to the French tax authority, and so on, was deemed perfectly utopian. Now it's a reality, and so progress can happen quite quickly. Okay, and when progress happens, it's worth, in my view, celebrating. It's rare, but sometimes it does happen, and it's worth celebrating because it means that more progress can happen in the future. So that's the first result, that's the good. But now, unfortunately, we must turn to the bad. The bad points to the fact that we've made very little progress in addressing tax evasion by multinational companies. So what is tax evasion by multinational companies? It's companies that make profits here in the UK or in India or in the US that end up booking those profits in very low tax countries like Bermuda or other tax havens, where the profits are taxed at very low rates of sometimes 0%, 5%, and so on. No, let's take just one very well-known example, but a very striking one. You take Google, the Alphabet, obviously one of the biggest companies on the planet. In 2003, just a few weeks before being listed as a public company in New York, they created a holding company in Bermuda. And then they sold their own part of their search and advertisement technology to their own Bermuda holding. And between 2003 and 2019, this Bermuda company has made hundreds of billions with a B, hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue and tens of billions in profits. In Bermuda, where the tax rate is a relatively modest tax rate of 0%. Okay, so that's just one example, but you see what the research shows is that this profit shifting is really an across-the-board phenomenon that you see in tech, that you see also in the pharmaceutical sector, in finance, in all the sectors of the economy. And US multinationals are particularly aggressive when it comes to shifting profits abroad. They shift perhaps about half of their non-US profits to tax havens. But this is also the case. But non-US multinationals also shift a significant fraction of their profits to tax havens. The outcome of all of that is what's plotted here on this graph, is that this shifting, this profit shifting by multinational companies reduces global corporate tax revenues quite significantly, by about 10%. It used to be zero in the 1970s, 1980s, when multinational companies were not big, or to be more precise, when most profits were booked domestically, US firms, only operating in the US, or almost only operating in the US, and so they couldn't book profits in Bermuda. But with the rise of multinational companies, with the rise of the tax planning, the tax avoidance industry, there's been a dramatic boom in profit shifting and the associated loss of tax revenues for governments globally. This increased particularly fast in the beginning of the 21st century, and then starting in 2015, policymakers started to take some action. So, very important, the OECD launched what is known as the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Process, BEPS. And then a number of countries, most importantly the US in 2018, passed tax reforms to try to curb profit shifting. So in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in the US in 2018, there are a number of measures to limit the ability of US multinational firms to shift profits to tax havens. But what the graph shows is that these policy initiatives have not been sufficient to reduce the profit shifting by multinational firms. It doesn't mean that those policies have been useless, that they have no effect. And perhaps absent those policies, the blue line would have kept increasing. And so maybe you can interpret the stabilization as reflecting the causal effect. It's very hard to know, but that's one possible interpretation, as reflecting the causal effect of those policies. But what we can conclude from that graph is that clearly what's been done so far has been insufficient to reduce the size of tax evasion by multinational firms. So here, everything remains essentially to be done. Now, there was very high hopes in 2021, and it was very exciting at the time, when 140 countries and territories agreed on a minimum corporate tax for multinational firms of 15%. A very important development, because it was the first time ever that there was an international agreement putting a floor to how low tax rates can go. Okay, we have lots of international agreements about lots of things, about international trade to be sure, also about taxation, but those agreements were silent about the most important aspect of tax policy, which at the end of the day is the tax rate. Okay? And here, in 2021, for the first time, 140 countries agree, and they said, look, multinational companies should pay at least 15% of their profits in taxes. Really a milestone in the regulation of globalization. But also, we could already see at the time that this was far from sufficient, in the sense that the rate that was chosen, 15%, is obviously very low. The corporate tax rate is much higher, is significantly higher in most countries. And the notion that multinational companies, the most powerful economic actors of today, should be legally allowed to pay significantly less tax than small domestic businesses, that doesn't make a ton of sense. So it was a first disappointment. It was also a disappointment in the sense that in 2020, just 1 year before that, there was a feeling that maybe there could be an agreement on a 20 or 21% minimum tax rate. In fact, in Joe Biden's presidential program when he ran in 2020, there was a 20% minimum tax for multinational firms. And at the beginning of the Biden administration was really proactive in trying to foster an international agreement on a 21% minimum rate. However, countries agreed on 15%. So what the graph shows here is that if you had a minimum tax rate of 20% on the profits of multinational firms, this would increase global corporate tax revenues by 16.7%. That's a lot of money. With 15%, which is what was decided in 2021, you can still generate an increase in global corporate tax revenues by about 9%. So less, but still something that's quite significant. Now, what has happened since 2021 is that the agreement has been weakened in different ways, which are shown here. The impact on tax revenues is shown here. A number of exemptions and carve-outs have been introduced. And the outcome of all of that is that today, and we in our observatory, we've developed what I think is the most sophisticated model to quantify all of that. If you run the numbers, today what we can expect from the agreement as it stands and as it's started to be implemented by about 30 countries in 2024 is that it's going to increase global corporate tax revenues by about only 5%, when just a few years ago we could expect much more than that. That's, as I said, an important development to have this global minimum tax, but at the same time, we could and we should have done much better. So what has gone wrong? At a high level, and then I'll talk a little bit about the details, but at a high level, a big problem that we face is that these issues of international taxation and agreements about tax evasion and so on, they are not discussed, to be honest, in a very democratic and inclusive manner. All of these things are discussed in very technical forums, very little discussion in parliament in the different countries, and this gives lobbying groups a lot of power to influence the outcome of those discussions. And at the end of the day, agreements are crafted, and then they go to parliament, and then members of parliament have like 2 days to vote on an extremely complex, 50 pages long bill full of new acronyms that's totally not understandable by anyone except a few tax experts. So there is this problem, and that's also the reason why we spend so much time trying to publish reports like that I think are in plain English, that are understandable by the public at large, trying to present those results broadly, to try to make the debate about these very important issues much more informed and much more democratic. So that's the high-level issue, and then in practice, how it has played out is a big kind of loophole that was introduced in that agreement was what is known as a carve-out for substance. That's really a very perverse thing, which says the following. It says that, okay, if a company has real activity in a tax haven, meaning it has factories or production, it employs people, it has a certain capital stock in a low-tax country, in a tax haven, then that company is allowed to deduct the corresponding amount of profit from the base of the minimum tax. So in plain words, what it means is that the more production you move to tax havens, then the more you are able to avoid the minimum tax, and your tax rate can keep being below 15%, could be 10%, 5%, 0%. The more you outsource production to tax havens, the less the minimum tax is binding, the more you can reduce your tax rate towards 0%. Very problematic measure because, from a basic economic perspective, of course, the incentives that this creates is that just it creates incentives for firms. If they want to keep paying less than 15%, the only way they can do that now is by moving production to tax havens. And of course, Google is not going to move back, head offices or production to Bermuda, but it's very easy for companies to move production to not zero tax places, but very low tax places like Ireland or Singapore or certain Swiss cantons, where the effective tax rate on profits is not 0%, but it's more like 5%. And in fact, when you talk to policymakers in those in those countries, they understand that this agreement is going to be a boon for them. You know, they like it very much. Like, yeah, that's really great. You know, we're actually going to attract more activity, and you know, okay, it's bad for Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, but it's good for us. And if it's good for them, to be very clear, it's unlikely to be good for the world as a whole, for the reasons they explained at the beginning. That's one thing. Okay. Probably the most important, and I'm happy, you know, perhaps if there are questions later on to discuss some of these other, somewhat more technical issues here. The second thing in this tax evasion by multinational companies bucket, you know, the bad. The second thing I want to point out is that at the same time that countries made some limited but real progress in terms of improving the taxation of multinational firms and reducing some forms of tax competition, other forms of tax competition dramatically increased. And what are those emerging forms of tax competition? It's essentially the emerging global green energy subsidies race. So you know, it all started essentially with China giving lots of subsidies to Chinese producers of green energy, solar panels and so on. And then the US, as you know, kind of retaliated with the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as everybody knows, has nothing to do with the reduction of inflation, but it's just all about giving tax credits for US producers of green energy. And then the European Commission, which for decades had enforced very strict rules against state subsidies for firms, said, oh, look, now we have to give subsidies to European producers of green energy. And so there is this new kind of phase of international tax competition that is happening today, which of course has a very positive aspect to it. To be very clear, the positive aspect, everybody understands, it can, and hopefully it will, accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy, and that has a crucial positive sum aspect. So that's, you know, that's much better than standard indiscriminate tax competition. But it also shares the same problem as standard tax competition, which is just that it risks fueling inequality, because essentially what you're doing with this type of approach is you're reducing the effective tax rate of multinational firms. That is, at the end of the day, more income on the bottom line of these firms, and so for the bottom line of the shareholders of those firms, who tend to be at the top of the income and the wealth distribution. And it also reduces government revenues quite significantly. That's what the graph shows here. Previous graph showed that, well, with the global minimum tax of multinational firms, we will increase global corporate tax revenues by about 5%. What the graph shows here is that it's quite uncertain, but in a low-end scenario, the global subsidies race is going to reduce global corporate tax revenues by about 5%, so essentially completely erasing the gains made here. In the baseline scenario, it's going to reduce global corporate tax revenues by 15%. So on one hand, we ask firms to pay $5 more. On the other, we're giving back 15. And in the high-end scenario, by perhaps about 20%. Okay, so the sums involved are really very big. And here, I think that, you know, collectively, this approach illustrates what's been at the heart of, in my view, our collective ability to fight climate change, which is that we are pitting against each other two very important objectives. First, the fight against climate change. Second, the fight against inequality. Because with that approach that kind of focuses on the use of subsidies, tax credits for fighting climate change, okay, we might make progress in the fight against climate change, but we risk increasing inequality. When in reality, there are lots of policies that we know very well that can allow us to make progress on both fronts at the same time, you know, like public investment in infrastructure, like new forms of international cooperation, and so on. You know, and more broadly speaking, all existential challenges of the past, you know, they've not been won by giving tax credits to firms. And I don't know when the US wanted to build Liberty ships in 1940. It's not like Roosevelt said, okay, we're going to give tax credits to US producers. of Liberty ships. No, that's not how it worked, but that's how we're trying to make this work at the moment. Anyway, that was for the bad, and now we can come to the most important, which is the ugly. So the ugly points to the fact that we have not started yet, and this might change, as we speak, but at least until very, very, very recently, we have not started to address what's probably the biggest problem in today's tax systems, which is that they fail to tax the very rich, and they are sharply regressing towards the top of the distribution. So that's what the graph here shows. So what the graph shows is, on the x-axis, you have the different groups of the income distribution. So P010 is the 10% of adult individuals with the lowest income, P1020 is the next decile, and so on. And towards the right here, you have a zoom at the very top of the distribution, and then the top group is dollar billionaires, okay? And on the y-axis, you have the effective tax rate paid by each of these groups of the population, taking into account all taxes paid by people at all levels of government, absolutely all taxes. So the income tax, consumption taxes, VAT, property taxes, corporate taxes that are fully allocated to the shareholders, to the owners of companies, everything. And so what the graph shows is, well, when you allocate all taxes to individuals, unsurprisingly, the different groups of the population pay a lot of tax. So for instance, in a relatively high tax country like France, where the total tax to national income ratio is around 50%, well, pretty much all the socioeconomic groups pay around 50% of their income in taxes, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, but with one big exception, billionaires who pay only 25% of their income in taxes. In the US, which is a relatively low tax country among high-income countries, tax rates are lower across the board, but there is also this trend at the very, very top where billionaires have a lower effective tax rate than other groups. In the Netherlands, which is kind of in between in terms of the total tax take, we have the same pattern of regressivity as in France, starting a bit lower in the distribution. And now there are a growing number of studies, in Italy, in Spain, in Sweden, in Norway, that show the same pattern of regressivity. And of course, we can debate about what should be the proper level of tax progressivity, and it's a very complicated question. It's easy to overshoot, and it's generally complicated. But when you look at opinion polls and when you ask people, nobody or almost nobody is okay with the notion that billionaires, super rich individuals, people with the highest ability to pay taxes should be allowed to pay less as a fraction of their income than the rest of the population. That's really something that is really impossible or very, very hard to justify. But that's the reality of our tax systems today. Hence, the main proposal that we formulated in the report, which is, let's fix that issue. And how are we going to fix it? Well, we can build on what's been done for multinational companies and try to replicate that approach. It has limitations, of course, but we can try to replicate that approach for the very rich. So just like we have an international agreement on a minimum tax for multinational firms, we could have an international agreement on a minimum tax for super rich individuals. We now know, after 2021, after the agreement for multinationals, that tax competition is not some kind of law of nature. We know that it's possible to craft international agreements like that, so let's do it. Let's do it for rich people. How can we do it practically? So we try to kind of start that conversation in the report by making a concrete proposal, which is only one proposal among many possible proposals, and the proposal is this. Let's focus first on global billionaires, not a big population. You have about 2,700 billionaires globally in 2023. Let's take global billionaires, and let's make sure that they pay a certain minimum amount of income tax each year. Okay, how are we going to define that minimum? Well, the notion of income for billionaires is not very well defined. And that's the reason why they have such low tax rates. I didn't explain that well. The reason why tax progressivity collapses here is because the income tax of billionaires falls, and sometimes to zero. You know, for instance, a striking illustration of that is what happened in I think it's 2021 or 2022 when there were revelations by the US media ProPublica on the taxes paid by US billionaires, and you see in some years people like Jeff Bezos paying zero or almost zero income tax, or Elon Musk paying zero or almost zero income tax. In 1 year, Bezos literally reports zero taxable income, and he says, look, I'm so poor, I'm claiming family benefits, and he receives family benefits. And you know, why is that? It's because when you're very, very rich, it's very easy to structure your wealth such that this wealth is not going to generate any taxable income. So in the case of Bezos, for instance, as CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay himself any salary. And then Amazon, as a firm, doesn't distribute dividends. And then, you know, it doesn't sell shares, and so it doesn't realize capital gains. And so that's how, in some years, he can literally report zero income and pay zero income tax. And what these studies show is that the problem goes beyond just a few, you know, cases, isolated cases like that. But there is a broader issue. So bottom line, the notion of income is too easy. No, income is too easy to manipulate for the very rich. And so you don't want to base the minimum tax on income. Let's say we had a 50% minimum tax out of income, but if income is zero, 50% of zero is zero, you've not made any progress. On the other hand, wealth for billionaires is relatively well defined. If you are a billionaire, it means that the market value of your assets, net of your debts, is more than $1 billion. Okay, so that's something that's tangible, that we can try to tax. And so the proposal is that global billionaires should pay in income tax each year at least the equivalent of 2% of their wealth. Okay, so someone who already pays a lot of income tax, it happens, you know, sometimes they sell shares, they realize lots of capital gains, fine, no extra tax to pay. But someone like Bezos who would pay zero income tax, that person would have to pay a top-up, an additional income tax to arrive at that minimum of 2%. So if his wealth is $100 billion, he would have to pay $2 billion extra in income tax. It's very modest, 2% is not a lot. To be clear, it is really not going to fix capitalism. It is very, very, very limited and modest, but it is also necessary because it would, you know, fix or at least allow to make significant progress on that issue, you know, on that really absurd, unjustifiable decline in tax progressivity at the very, very top, which is important for a number of reasons. First, for basic fairness issues. Second, because it's very difficult to ask other groups of the population to pay more tax, and there is a need for that, for infrastructure, for climate, for health, for education. But it's very hard to ask other people to pay more when those economic actors who have the highest tax deficit, you know, don't pay more in the first place. And third, it's important because the revenue, the tax revenues involved are actually quite significant. So that's what the table shows. Although billionaires are very few in number, they have a lot of wealth, not enough wealth inequality. They have about $13 trillion in wealth globally. Currently, they pay not a lot of income tax, the problem shown on this graph. They pay around $44 billion globally in income tax, so that if you force them to pay at least 2% of their wealth in tax, in 2023, this would have generated $240 billion in additional tax revenue globally. And so you might say, well, okay, 240 billion, let's say 250, you know, in 2024 or 2025, is that a lot of money? You know, what does it mean? I think the best way to answer that question is to do the following comparison. According to the best estimates that we have, developing countries need an additional $500 billion in government revenue to face the challenges of climate change. Okay? And so what we found in the report is that you can get there with two models. Again, I emphasize that this is really not the communist revolution. This is really very small steps towards a slightly better world. But with two small steps, you can get there. 500 billion. You can do, with the global minimum tax on billionaires, you can get around 250 billion. And with a strengthened minimum tax on multinational firms, a rate of 20%, getting rid of the loopholes, you can get an extra $250 billion. Now, what I find exciting is that there is actually, I think, genuine momentum politically for such ideas, in particular for this coordinated minimum tax on the super rich. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So there are a number of aspects. One is at the international level, Brazil this year has the presidency of the G20. And they are very much interested in making those issues of progressive taxation, fighting inequality, a cornerstone of their presidency. And so they decided to put those questions on the agenda. And so actually, they invited me 2 weeks ago to present that proposal to the G20 finance ministers who are meeting in São Paulo. And it was the first time that these issues of tax progressivity, of tax justice, of extreme inequality were discussed in such a forum. And what I witnessed then in the response by the different ministers is, some of them, didn't comment on that. Most of them said, look, we praise Brazil for putting those issues on the agenda. We think that there is a need, and I think that's really important, a need for new international agreements focused on these questions of progressive taxation, of trying to root out the inequalities that otherwise can corrode democratic societies. So there is a need for a new form of regulation of globalization. These issues have been completely ignored in forums like the G20 for decades, and 2 weeks ago, for the first time, there was a recognition that, look, this should be discussed. And then, even more than that, some countries, France, can you believe it? Finance minister of France said, look, very much in favor of a coordinated minimum tax on the super rich. Brazil, of course, kind of behind all of that, very much in favor. But also, interestingly, the U.S. What's happening in the U.S. is really interesting. In 2019, 2020, in the previous presidential campaign in the U.S., Joe Biden campaigned against proposals for wealth taxation that at the time were defended by people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and he was very much against that. And then he was elected president, and he put in his own budget as president what he calls a billionaire income tax, which is very close in spirit to that proposal. Not exactly, the details, the same, but very close in spirit. It's this idea that, okay, billionaires pay too little; they should pay a minimum. They should pay a minimum each and every year. And he goes regularly, on TV or talking about how billionaires don't pay their fair share. 3 days ago in his State of the Union, he again reiterated that proposal. And so indeed, in São Paulo, the Treasury Secretary of the U.S. said, look, this type of proposal that makes sense to me, because indeed, in our budget, we have something that's not very far, at least in spirit, to that idea. So that's why I think there is genuine political momentum. At the same time, if I see the glass half empty now, I think it's fair to say that there is one tax that the very rich really hate. That's this tax. That's the wealth tax. They really hate it. And they have good reasons to hate it. That's the only tax that really works for them. And so, they're going to fight, to be clear. They're going to fight, and you don't want to underestimate the power or the resources that they would put into that fight. But, the fact that we're moving potentially toward that conversation, I think, in itself is quite positive. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit and then conclude. Let me talk a little bit about a very important question, which is a very important point, which is that even though international cooperation is always better, there is a lot that countries can do unilaterally, individually, to try to address some of those issues. And in the report, we explain, these different unilateral measures that countries could implement, and I'm not going to detail all of that. I'm just going to talk about one, the most important one, which is the first one. So imagine that tomorrow, not holding my breath, but imagine that tomorrow the UK creates a law, a tax on billionaires, let's say, on the super rich, a wealth tax. Okay? And as you know, when it comes to taxing the super rich, the debate ends up being always about one thing mainly, which is, okay, the risk that they might move out of the country. The debate is always about that. This is what has deeply undermined the wealth taxes of the different countries in Europe and elsewhere that used to have a wealth tax. Debate is always about that. But what's really important to understand is that this issue has a solution, which is a very simple solution, which is simply that we should keep taxing the very rich after they've moved. So today, the way that most countries, essentially almost all countries except the US, operate is that if someone has become very rich in the UK and now decides to move to Switzerland, let's say, then starting January 1st of next year, that person has no tax to pay anymore in the UK. But what the UK could say is, look, if you've lived 60 years in the UK and you've become a billionaire and now you decide to move to a low tax place, look, we're going to keep taxing you after you've left, as if you were still a UK resident. And the logic, and we can do that for maybe 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, we can discuss. And the logic is obvious and is very strong. The logic is, if you've become very rich in the UK, that's in part at least because you've benefited from UK education and healthcare and the workers of your businesses as well, and UK infrastructure and public goods and services. And so there's just no natural right, once you become very rich, to move and then to have no tax anymore to pay. And this is really important because this is the type of approach that doesn't require any international agreement. Any country alone can do that. And it is really well-founded conceptually, theoretically. So I think at some point this will happen. Now the question is, okay, why haven't countries already done that in the past? And I think the best answer is, I think most countries policymakers felt that they wouldn't be able in practice to enforce the tax on people who have left, that they wouldn't have the information. But that's where, getting back to the good, there is now this automatic exchange of bank information where the UK receives data about the Swiss bank accounts of British people, and so now it becomes much easier to implement this type of unilateral anti-exile tax. Okay, let me just conclude by saying that most important, tax evasion is not a law of nature, it's a policy choice. Some policies have been effective, the automatic exchange of bank information, others are falling short, like the minimum tax on multinational companies. Some issues remain, at least until very recently, unaddressed, like the taxation of high net worth individuals. And the second big idea is that the ideal is international coordination, but really a lot can be achieved unilaterally. The key kind of underlying idea behind all of that thinking on unilateral action is that any country at the end of the day can play the role of tax collector of last resort. Now let's say billionaires live in some countries and pay no tax in their residence country. There's always a country or a group of countries that can say, look, if you're not taxed in the country where you live, we will tax you because you have access to our market, because you spend some time shopping here in London or in Paris. And so there's always a group of countries that can play this all-important role of tax collector of last resort. And this is really key to change the dynamic of global tax competition and at the end of the day, reconcile globalization with tax justice. Thank you very much.
Great. Lovely to see so many people here to talk about soaking the rich, tax justice. So that was a great lecture, important topic, lots of good information and positive